Trialz with Scott Wiley.
Yeah, 2009 to 2010.
Yeah, it was the ARA stimulus package, right?
Yeah.
When they did that, what is it, $1 trillion, which at the time we're like, we're spending $1 trillion, but now after COVID, we're like, oh, we spent 5 trillion. I guess the trillion was small.
Right. And the other thing about that, it was a double-edged sword because it was great to get folks to adopt, EHR, but I often wonder, was that quick adoption, part of the reason why it's so fragmented today? Because one challenge in EHR is everyone's on a different version, and so folks were so quick to adopt before there was any kind of standardization at the time.
Yeah, and I don't think the standardization was the problem. It was the intent of what people thought an EHR would deliver. So people thought it would deliver interoperability and you'd be able to just share data easily between the systems.
Right.
That's not what EHRs were. EHRs were these big billing engines that got people paid quicker. And that's the problem, right? In fact, they literally yanked the language out of the High-Tech Act, which was part of ARA, the stimulus package, that around interoperability, because they knew they just couldn't deliver it because they weren't developed that way. Of course, it was a shovel-ready project, remember, right? Like this $1 trillion of shovel-ready stuff that will stimulate, that took about like 3 years before any money was spent. And then another like 6-8 years to spend it all. It's like crazy.
Wow. Very cool. So speaking of the pandemic, how has that kind of changed what you're doing or your approach, if it has?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's changed too much for us. I mean, events were interesting, right? I think, but we're almost back to normal there. I think, like for the most part, people want to be there. In fact, there's been these like celebratory conferences where you go there and you see these old friends and you're like, man, reunited again. I can't believe it. You're just so excited. So, I mean, but we were lucky because we've been digital first since the beginning. And so, it was hard because of our events, but from a publishing standpoint, we were already ready to do digital. So that wasn't a problem. Now in the bigger healthcare space, they're still suffering, right? Like the budgets suffered from lack of patients coming in, many patients that haven't come back, the burnout of all the doctors and nurses and they're leaving. The staffing crisis in healthcare right now is actually pretty scary. And you can't just like churn up doctors the way Amazon churns up factory workers, right? It's 10 years to go through the whole, MD process. So like, you're not churning up more doctors. If they're gone, they're gone. And so, that's going to be a real crisis for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, folks often think of doctors because they're highly educated and we think of the science, but it's a just a hands-on profession. It's a very specific skill, and I think right now lots of labor markets, whether it's physician or an accountant, those very specialized skills, incredible demand in the labor market. Yep. So speaking of that, what do you think's next? So we kind of talked about the past. What direction do you think these things are headed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, healthcare has all sorts of challenges, right? And I like to say if it was easy, it would have been done long ago, right? What's the point of, if it's not easy, it's all hard. But there's something really fascinating for me. And I see it as like the confluence of all these different pressures. One is one that you mentioned, right? Around the EHR and the fact that now we have the data. Right? Like think about value-based care. That's like kind of a buzzword, like let's move to value and let's actually treat the whole person rather than just, treat them like a cog in our system that we're going to churn through as quick as we can. Let's actually keep them healthy and get paid for doing that. Think about how you would do value-based care in a paper world. You're like, okay, I want to identify all the patients that have high blood pressure and this symptom and that. And you're like, okay, what am I going to do? Go through all 10,000 paper charts and like find it? Now it's 2 clicks. And I'm like, oh, these are all the ones that are at risk. Like this is a massive change. So that's like one is the data is there from the EHRs, data is there from the sensors. And then we also have the increase of computing power, the power of cloud, the speeds that are happening, right? To be able to process all that data and make sense of it. That's happening right now too. The interoperability, the communication systems. before, okay, let's say you did finally figure out who you wanted to take care of in a value-based cared world. Well, what would you do then? Send them a letter that says, hey, your blood pressure's out of whack, right? Like
Right.
now we can do that. It's a simple text message or email and boom, they get the information. So when you combine the data, the AI, the communication systems, everything that's happening, like what we haven't done in healthcare is package that into something that's like really beautiful. And so like to me, I look at it and I compare it to the iPhone. Think about what the iPhone did. Did Apple invent anything? Not really, maybe a few small things, but they packaged all the innovation. The Gorilla Glass from Corning, right? The accelerometer from someone else, the GPS and all the GPS data from it, the touch screen, the processors from, the Snapdragon processors that they input it. They just packaged it in a way that made it useful, but it was this confluence of innovations that made the iPhone change the world.
Right.
And a great marketing team.
That didn't hurt either, right?